My name is Todd Miranda, and the purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate how to build styles that can be shared among heterogeneous elements in WPF. So let's begin by creating a new Microsoft Visual Studio project. We'll create a standard WPF Windows application project. We'll call this Heterogeneous Styles. And we'll begin using our grid, and we'll go ahead and keep the default height and width of our window. That should be fine for our purposes. And the first thing we're going to do, because we need a couple of columns, so we'll specify a set of column definitions, and we'll start with the first column definition. Its width will be auto, we'll say. And the second column definition, its width will be auto. And then we'll do a couple of row definitions. So we'll create the first row definition, and there will be just one row. Technically, in a case where you've only got one row, you really don't have to create that row definition, but we'll do that just for good measure, just so that we've got good standards and we can come back and follow what we did. Okay, so let's start with some controls. Let's put a list box in our first grid cell. So we'll specify a grid.row of 0 and a grid.column of 0. Columns and rows are 0 based in WPF. And we'll specify a width of auto for this, a height of auto. And in our list box, we'll have some list box items. And let's do it like this. We'll do that. And we'll add a few of these, so we'll just copy and paste that a few times. So we've got some items in our list box. Very simple, nothing complicated. And then in our second column, let's have a stack panel. And a stack panel simply just lets us stack things by default in a vertical manner or a horizontal manner if you set the orientation for that. So we'll set grid.column on this to be 1 and grid.row to be 0. And we're going to leave the default orientation of vertical. And in here we're going to have a couple of buttons. And maybe for this application we'd have a button that allowed us to add elements to our list, and then we'd have a button that allowed us to remove elements from our list. We might even have a button that allowed us to edit. Okay, so although there's not a lot to this, we can see that this might be the way that we would lay out, a page in a standard application. So let's build that and let's take a look at what we have so far. Should be just a simple window with a list box and some buttons here just next to it. So nothing fancy there. Alright, on our grid, let's move it away from the edge of our window just a little bit. We'll do that by setting a margin, and we'll just set a margin of 10 all the way around so that it moves it away from the edge of our window. Okay, so we have these elements on our page. Now we need to look at styling those particular elements. And we've got two different types of elements. We've got buttons, we've got a list box, we could have other elements as well. We could have some text blocks if we needed that capability. So let's go into our list box, and let's just say that we want to set the background to slate. Let's choose slate gray. And if we're going to do that, we need to set our foreground to something we can read more easily, so we'll set foreground to white. We might even want to set the font size to something a little bit larger, so we'll set the font size to 16. Now, for purpose of this presentation, we want to apply those same styles to our buttons. So we really want all these elements to look very similar to one another. So let's take a look at what we've done by applying those attributes on our elements. And you can see there that our font size is a little larger now, but we still have our standard old list box. We have our buttons here, all of them now with the background of slate gray and white text. So we know that we don't really usually want to have inline style settings like this, or inline properties that affect the visual layout of our control. It'd be a lot easier to set those as styles. So let's create a window.resources block, and in our window.resources block we'll create a style, and we're going to set the target type to be button. That way we don't have to specify a key for this particular style. And we're going to create a setter with a property of background and a value of slate gray. And we also set a couple of other properties. We set foreground. We set foreground to white. And we set font size. We set font size to 16, I believe. Let's check that. Yes, font size was 16. Now, for our buttons then, that means that we can eliminate these inline styles, because we've created a style that's global to our window. And since we didn't specify a key, we just simply specified a target type. All buttons on the page will now inherit this style, which is fine for now. Let's create another style block. And I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll cheat just a little bit, since we want to apply the same style to our list box. And we'll do that. Now we can remove the same inline style information out of our list box. So let's verify that we haven't changed anything, that our application still looks the same. And it does. We're simply using styles now instead of inline property attribute settings. Well, you can see now that we've got the exact same style, and we've got that style for two different types of target elements. If we don't specify the target type, then we have to specify the target type as part of the property. So let's see if we can simplify our styles now, because we only have two elements. We've got a button and a list box. If we had many more, this could get much more complicated. So instead of specifying a target type, let's give this style a key name, and we'll call this my style. Okay? And in there now we have to specify the type of element that we're going to use, so that WPF knows where to get that particular style, or what type of that particular type of style to set. Okay, so now by doing that, we can combine within the same style block, we can combine setters for multiple elements as long as we specify the element type. So we'll copy list box. Okay, so now in this one style we've set properties for our button types of elements and our list box types of elements. So now we can go down here, and we have to specify a style now, and we'll use a markup syntax to get a static resource my style, and we'll apply this style to all the elements that we want to use it. And in this case, that's all the elements that we have here on our page. Again, let's run this. Let's take a look at it, make sure that everything looks the same. Good. So we haven't changed the visual layout of the page. We've just simply changed how we've organized those property setters, how we've organized that particular style. But again, we've made things a little more simpler because we've combined things in one style, but we've got a lot of duplication within that style. And if we had many more elements, this in itself would become unwieldy. So how can we further summarize this? How can we further make this a little easier to work with? Well, button does not actually have a background property. The background property that you set on a button is actually an inherited property from a base class. foreground and font size is the same way. Obviously, a button doesn't have a font size property. In fact, the font size property is applied to the visual element, which is the text block within the button. But the bottom line is it's a inherited style, not a property that's actually on this particular element. So we can set those properties and specify that it's the property on the base class, and by doing that, if all of our elements have this base class in their inheritance tree, we can set the properties by specifying that base class, and we can set the properties both on different types of elements, on our list box and our buttons. So let's see how that works. Great. So now we've applied the same style block to two different types of elements, two heterogeneous elements, and still being able to set those properties similarly on both elements. So let's take this just one step further. Let's say you've got one or two elements you want to apply the style to that they have their own little bit of some property that you want to set that's unique to them. Well, we've seen that we can have setters in one single style block that apply to multiple types of controls. So we can go to the list box dot selected index, which you typically are not going to set this in a style, but for demonstration purposes this will work. Okay, so what this means is any element that we apply this style to, it's going to look and say, yes, I can set the background because I inherit from control. I can set these other properties as well because I inherit from control. I'm not a list box, so I can't set this property, so this gets ignored by everything but a list box. Doesn't exactly get ignored, but for purposes of the presentation, for purposes of the demonstration, we'll say yes, it gets ignored by any element that does not have a selected index, and in this case, any element that's not a list box. So now let's run this, and what we'll see is obviously all of our styles are the same, but note that on the list box element we've applied that very unique setter, the list box.selected index, to select an index value of 1. So that's how we apply styles to heterogeneous elements and still get the desired effect of setting those properties across those types of elements.